Hey everybody, it's Paul. Bet you didn't know how glue works. Bet you also never really even thought about it. But I'm here to say I love glue and I love figuring out how things like this work, and I'm here to explain how glue works to you. We're going to talk about the three most common types of glue and how they work. Now, to understand how glue works, we need to know one thing, and that is, what is glue? Glue is essentially two objects. One is a suspension, and that is a liquid, a suspendable liquid that the material floats in. And the other is actually the binding material, and that is actually what the glue is. So we have a suspension material and a binding material, and they live together. They're mixed together, and that is what creates glue. When you see a bottle of glue, say a bottle of white glue, what you're seeing is a suspension material, water, and the glue-like material that isn't the binding material that is in there, that is left over when the water evaporates. And that is actually how glue works. Now, why is that important? Well, when you're putting two things together and you want them to stick, knowing what glue works best in each situation will allow for the best binding. Now, let's talk about how glue works. When you take two objects and you glue them together, say these are two pieces of paper and you glue them together, these objects do not become one object. These two objects share something that allows them to stick together, and that thing that they're sharing is the glue. Glue does not bind two things together. Glue only sticks to glue. It only sticks to itself. And so that's why often on the packaging it says clamp the object together, because you want to make sure that the glue sticks to itself. So there's three different kinds of glue that we're going to talk about today. White glue, which is like standard craft glue. We're going to talk about wood glue, and then we're going to talk about super glue. Each one of those is a suspension of binding material inside of a liquid. Typically the liquid is water, but with super glue it's actually an alcohol solvent material that reacts with atmospheric or water moisture. So let's pretend that these pieces of foam are actually paper, and we're going to zoom in on them. It's going to be really close up, and we can see that that paper has little gaps in it, okay? Because paper, while it looks like a solid sheet, actually is porous. It has a lot of holes and striations inside of it. Now, if we're going to use white glue, that'd be the best glue to bind paper to paper, okay? What we would do is we'd read the package on the outside. It says, take a little bit of glue and smear it onto both sides. White glue inside the suspension has these little weird amorphic shaped blobules that float inside water, okay? Back in the day, way back when, we actually used to make it out of gelatin, which is actually ground up bones from cows and horses. That's why when you look at the Elmer's glue container, it's got that picture of that cow on there, because that's what the glue used to be made out of. And the joke about sending horses off to be turned into glue, that's what it means. The gelatin are actually like little blobs, okay? When it's wet, when gelatin is wet, much like Jello, it's gooey and wobbly and stuff like that. But when it starts to dry out, all of it kind of dries and sticks to itself, and it becomes really, really sticky and dried together. And that's what white glue does. It's got these amorphic shapes that kind of float in this liquid, and then when the liquid disappears, when it evaporates, these parts stick together. And so if we were looking at a piece of paper here, what we want to do is we want to take a little bit of that white glue and kind of shove it into the paper. We want to smear it on both sides, and what that's going to do is it's going to take those little amorphic shapes and it's going to shove them into the fibers of that paper like that. And then we're going to do it on the other side too. On the other piece of paper, we're going to smear it on both sides until we get little bits of glue particles stuck inside the paper on both sides. And then we press the two together, and when we press them together and clamp it, the glue, the little globules actually stick to each other. They're not actually sticking to the paper, they're sticking to themselves. And that, once it evaporates, that liquid, the suspension evaporates, those little pieces of amorphic goo will actually lock themselves together in between both those pieces of paper. And that's how that glues it together, right? It adheres it together. And the tighter that gap is between them, the more likely it's going to hold strongly. Now, wood glue is very, very similar to white glue in that it is a water suspension with a material that's floating in it. But with wood glue, what they use is actually wood. They would take bits of wood, and we'll say it's kind of like this fiber here, this fiber fill here, if we were to look at it really, really closely. And it has all these tiny little fibers of wood inside of a suspension. Again, a liquid suspension. And what that does is you would wet one side of the wood, and when you do that, when you wet wood, it expands a little bit and it opens up those little spaces in between the wood, and then we can take the long filaments of wood in the wood glue and we can shove it inside those holes, okay, and those gaps that have appeared on both sides of the wood. So we have two pieces of wood, we do that twice over, and we're smushing and we're applying that glue to both sides. And then when we clamp them together, what happens is those fibers intermingle in between both of those pieces of wood. And then as the wood dries out and the suspension material is evaporated, those striations in the wood close up and lock around the fiber that's in there. And that is actually what holds the pieces of wood together. The tighter that bond is, that's why we clamp wood together, the better, the stronger the bond is going to be with the wood. Okay. What you don't want to do is apply so much glue that there's a gap between where the two pieces of wood are, because what happens is then you're relying on just those tiny little fibers, the smallest microscopic fibers, to hold these pieces of wood together, and they're not going to. They're going to tear. And it's the same with any kind of glue. If you use too much glue between the surfaces, you're just saying, I want the glue to hold them together. Because again, we're not changing the physicality of these shapes. We're only adding a material to bind them together, to mechanically lock them together. The last one that I want to talk about is super glue. Super glue is a little bit different, but it's something that everybody uses every single day. And what super glue is it is still a suspension, but instead of it being a suspension in water, it is actually a chemical that is reactive to moisture. And inside that suspension are actually tiny little crystals that look a little bit like these triangle chunks that you see here with these weird shapes on the sides. And they float randomly inside that suspension material. But when it comes into contact with moisture, the chemical that it's suspended in sends a signal to all of these little crystals to tell it to align, so that they all align perfectly in the exact same order. So they're floating around, and then it goes slap like that, and mechanically like locks them that way. And since they're jagged little edges are all over them and they're all different shapes, sometimes those little edges will lock themselves to each other, but sometimes they will be inside of, say, a hole like this, and it would actually like mechanically lock itself nice and tight inside them. That's why super glue works really well on objects like porcelain, because porcelain has tiny little holes inside of it. So when you push the super glue inside of it, those crystals can then lock and twist and form and create a mechanical lock inside all of those when pressed together to the other piece. When you're like putting back your coffee cup that you dropped, you add a little bit of super glue to both sides, press it together really tightly, then those little crystals form inside the little gaps that are inside there and lock itself together. So that is how glue works. It is a suspension material with a adhesive material inside of it, and that when the suspension disappears, you're left with just the connective parts, and using the right glue in the right surface is going to give you the best bond. Bet you didn't know that. And remember to work smarter, not harder. I hope you guys learned something today. I know that I did. See you next time.